Well, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be going through 8 rules that will almost guarantee you get into at least the top 4 or 5% in your AFL tipping competition. And the best part of this is you don't have to know anything about football. All the information and all the data you need is already out there on the internet. And I am going to be going through all of that today in this video. Now, rule number 1 is your weekly score doesn't matter. Now, what does this mean? It sounds ridiculous. Of course it matters. And yes, it kind of does. But if I said to you 6 tips out of 9, is that a good score? You're probably thinking, yeah, it's not bad. It's average. I'll take it. But what if I said the average score in that round across all the tipsters was 4 out of 9? Then 6 is a very good score. But if I said the average score in that round was 8 out of 9, then all of a sudden it's a pretty bad round of tipping. So what I want you to start thinking, guys, is about how your score was relative to everybody else, not what the total score was in terms of a number. Rule number 2, don't tip with your heart or your head. Now, we all know the saying, go with your head, not your heart. Don't tip your favourite team every week. And well, maybe if you're a Sydney Swans supporter, you can tip your favourite team every week. But for the rest of us, we really shouldn't be doing that. It's just wasting a tip. But what do I mean when I say don't go with your head either? Well, unless you're Nostradamus, you don't know more about football than everyone else. Unfortunately, there are some websites out there that have a lot of analytics and data within them to help you make an informed decision. Now, if you haven't seen this website, this is the Squiggle. And what it basically does is it takes a bunch of different analytics models and aggregates them together to come up with an average prediction across the board in terms of all those models as to how not only a singular game but the whole season is projected to look. And the important part we want to look at here is the tipping aspect of it, and we are going to be looking at round 18 for this example. And you can see here it does give a percentage prediction in terms of the head-to-head likelihood of each game. And if we click into it, we can see how each analytics model predicts the game will go. For this example, we'll be looking at round 18. So let's click into the Collingwood versus Geelong game. And we can see the aggregate percentage up the top and also the percentage of all the different models as we scroll down. And what I like to look at is the S10 prediction. And that is the average of the best 10 performing analytics models of this year. And that's probably going to be the one you want to go for if you're following my method. And I will leave a link to the Squiggle website in the description of this video, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. There is a lot of data and different functionalities on there, and it's a really good way to understand how teams are going in terms of their scoring, their performance, their output relative to other clubs, because we know the ladder is not always the most accurate reflection. We will be coming back to the Squiggle later in this video. Now, rule number 3 is think about how everyone else is tipping. Now, remember, we are measuring your performance relative to everyone else. So it's very important to think about how everyone else is tipping so you can minimize your risk. Now, if you use the AFL's tipping website, it does give you the percentages, which is very helpful. And just looking at round 18, you can see that there is a heavily favoured team in every game. So that's going to make your life easier depending on whether you want to be conservative or aggressive with your strategy. So just keep that in mind and we'll circle back to that. If you don't tip using the AFL's website and your platform doesn't show the percentages, you can just create a dummy account on the AFL tipping website to see these percentages. So don't worry too much. Rule number 4, never tip a big outsider. Now, this might seem counterintuitive if you do think that outsider has a chance to win, but it's never worth doing this unless it is a Hail Mary play in the last round or 2 of the season, and I'm going to explain why. So if we look here at the Sydney versus North Melbourne game, 98% of tipsters predicting Sydney, 2% of tipsters predicting North Melbourne. And if we look at the Squiggle, you can see that it is a similar prediction in terms of an over 90% chance of Sydney winning. So basically what this means is if it's 95% for Sydney, that means 19 times out of 20 in the simulated predictions, Sydney is going to win that game. And 98% of tipsters are tipping Sydney. So let's just say hypothetically, you had a really good feeling about North Melbourne. You really thought North were going to win. You might be thinking, I'll tip North and get a tip that no one else is going to get right. But even if you did feel that way, according to the analytics, North are going to lose 19 times out of 20. And if everyone else is tipping Sydney, 19 times out of 20, you are giving a free tip to everyone else. Now, let's say you tip Sydney and North win just like you thought. What does that mean? Well, it means nothing because everyone else effectively has got it wrong too. So you are exposing yourself to a massive amount of risk when you do tip a big outsider because by rights, most of the time they're not going to win. So it's just a no-brainer. There's enough 50-50 games in any round where you can catch your opponents. Just tip the heavy favourite every time. Don't even think about it. Even if you think the outsider has a chance to win, just tip the favourite. Rule number 5, only a few games a week matter. Following on from what we just said, there's usually only 2 to 4 games a week that really matter, and they are the 50-50 games. As I said before, if there's any team favoured by more than around 56-57% in the squiggle, just tip the favourite, don't even think about it. So let's look at this round 18. Based on the squiggle percentages, you can see here Collingwood Geelong is about a 50-50, Hawthorn Freo is about a 50-50, Sydney versus North, we're just going to tip Sydney, Western Bulldogs Carlton is a 50-50, Melbourne v Essendon is close to a 50-50, so let's just leave that. Adelaide versus St Kilda, we're going to tip Adelaide. Gold Coast versus Port, we're going to tip Gold Coast. GWS versus Richmond, we're going to tip GWS. And West Coast Eagles versus Brisbane, we're just going to tip Brisbane. So automatically that reduces the round from 9 games down to 4. And those 4 50-50 games are going to be the ones that matter. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a solution as to how you tip these 50-50 games. You're going to have to work that one out yourself. But there is plenty of tools and data out there that can help you make that decision. Now, I just wanted to show you this quickly. So far, the S10 aggregate, that is the average of the best 10 performing models in the system on Squiggle, has tipped 94 tips so far this year as at the end of round 16. Now, if we look at the AFL's tipping competition, the leader at the end of round 16 is on 103 tips. So that's beaten the aggregate on the Squiggle by 9 tips. And 9 divided by 16 rounds is just over half a tip a round. So you only have to beat the S10 aggregate by around half a tip every week in order to pretty much be winning any tipping competition that you might be in. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to take big risks when you're doing this. Just get those 50-50s right more often than not, and you're going to be pretty much unbeatable. Rule number 6, be consistent for the 50-50 games. Now, just like the 50-50 games are going to be the difference between you winning the competition, they also could be the reason you lose because you go back to old habits and don't use the data. So what I would recommend here is picking a metric and sticking to it when it comes to the 50-50 games. You want to be taking the emotion and the human element out of it as much as possible. Now, there's no right or wrong way to do this. You might always tip the home team in a 50-50 game. You might always tip the betting favourite in a 50-50 game. You might always tip the most experienced team. There's no right or wrong answer, but I would recommend you just pick one of these metrics or something different and stick to it because you're going to make mistakes when you flip-flop week after week. You could even look in the squiggle and find one of the individual models that you really like, maybe the best performing one. And if that tips differently to the aggregate, and you could just choose whatever that picks in the 50-50 games. Just as a side note, all these models will already take into account the home ground advantage, so that has already been factored into the calculations. Rule number 7, tip as late in the week as possible. There's really no reason to be putting in your tips on a Sunday night or Monday morning when the first game isn't till Thursday or Friday. You really want to be tipping as late as possible because that's going to give you and the analytics models the most chance to get the latest information, whether that's weather, injuries, team changes, matchups, suspensions, whatever it is. You want to have as much data and information at your disposal as possible. So whether that's putting in your tips on a Thursday afternoon when there's a Thursday night game or a Friday afternoon when there's a Friday night game, that's fine. Up to you whether you want to change your tips as the weekend goes on, like whether you change your Saturday tips on a Saturday morning after the first game's already been played. Personally, I don't do that, but it is an option if you're comfortable doing that. But really, you need to make sure you're sticking to the facts and not letting your emotion get in the way if you are going to do that. Rule number 8, be conservative if you're winning. If you're ahead in your competition, you've got to remember that your opponents are going to be thinking, what risks can I take to catch up? And when you take risks in tipping, you make mistakes and you give tips to your opponents. If you're winning, there's never a reason to tip an outsider. Just be as safe as possible. Go with the crowd, tip what the majority of tipsters are tipping, and by the laws of averages, you are going to maintain your lead. There's no point panicking because you don't need to take a risk. You're already ahead. Just sit on the lead, do the basics, rewatch this video, and you'll be fine. So guys, remember these 8 rules. Save this video, come back to it. I know it's late in the year. Ideally, I'd put this out before round 1. But maybe if you're a long way back in your tipping competition this year, you could start using this strategy for the rest of the year and just see how you go. See if you outperform how you went at the start of the year. And then you'll be setting yourself up for success next year. If I've missed anything, let me know down below. But that is all we're going to have time for in this video today, guys. Thanks for watching and make sure you subscribe for more.